He came every Thursday. Same time. Same boots dusted to the ankle. Same quiet nod. Same flowers. Cora Whitfield had been arranging dried lavender into bunches when the bell above her door gave its thin copper ring. And there he was again, the cowboy she knew only as the man who wanted columbine and lupin, white and blue, wrapped in brown twine. He removed his hat at the door, every time, as though he were entering a church. The crown of his hat was creased deep from years of the same hand gripping the same spot. His knuckles were scarred across the back like a fence line after a hard winter. She did not know his name. He had never offered it, and she had never asked. In the months since he first appeared, they had spoken perhaps 40 words between them. He pointed to the flowers. She wrapped them. He left 3 silver dimes on the counter. Always the exact amount, never more, never less. The bell rang. He was gone. But Cora noticed things. She noticed them the way she noticed which way the wind bent the grass. Not because she was trying, but because years of loneliness had trained her eyes to read every detail of the few human beings who crossed her path. His shirts were always clean, though never new. He smelled of saddle leather and pine smoke, and underneath it all, something she could not name, something that made her think of a man standing alone in a large, empty room. And when he picked up the wrapped flowers, his fingers cradled the stems with the same care a man would use to lift a sleeping child. And she noticed the flowers themselves. White columbine, blue lupin, the same combination, every Thursday, without variation. She grew the columbine in the greenhouse behind the shop, coaxing the blooms through Colorado's dry air with well water and patience. The lupin she gathered from the meadow above Sage Creek, where it grew wild in thick purple-blue spires. She had tried, once, to add a sprig of something else, and he had shaken his head. Just the two. It was the columbine that unsettled her. Not because columbine was unusual. It grew everywhere in the foothills, spilling over rocks in the high meadows. What unsettled her was that Thomas used to bring her columbine. White columbine, gathered from the same meadow where she now picked lupin. He would come through the door with his hat full of them, grinning like a boy who had found treasure, and he would say, "The mountain's putting on her Sunday best. Cora, I brought you a piece." She had not thought about that in years. She had trained herself not to think about Thomas in daylight hours. Grief, she had learned, was a creature that fed on regular meals. Starve it between dawn and dusk, and it would wait, patient, until the lamps were lit and the shop was closed and the dark pressed against the windows. Then it would sit beside her and eat its fill. She had been managing that way for 3 years. The cowboy left. The bell rang. Cora watched through the window as he crossed the dusty street, his long shadow stretching ahead of him in the late afternoon light. He turned left at the livery stable, the way he always did, toward the south road. The cemetery was south. She had followed him once, 3 months back, not on purpose, but because she had been walking to the post office and happened to see him at the far end of the road, standing at the edge of the fenced graveyard with his hat in his hand. She had not gone close enough to see which grave. Before we go further, settle in wherever you are tonight. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from. Whether you're folding laundry in Ohio or sitting on a porch in Queensland, we like knowing who's with us when the story gets quiet. It was a Thursday in late September when the ground beneath Cora's life began to shift, though she did not know it yet. The aspens on the ridge above Sage Creek had turned the color of fresh honey, and the air carried the first thin edge of frost. She was tying a bundle of dried yarrow when the door opened and a different kind of cold walked in. Hale Pruitt filled a doorway the way a thunderhead fills a valley. He was broad, red-faced, and wore his wealth in the silver conchos on his belt and the careful cut of his coat. He owned the Bar P, the largest ranch in the basin. He owned the water rights to Sage Creek. He owned the note on Harlan Beach's farm. And he owned, as far as anyone in town could tell, the sheriff. Ms. Whitfield. He did not remove his hat. He never did. Been thinking about my offer. Mr. Pruitt. She did not look up from the yarrow. And I've been thinking about my answer. It hasn't changed. Everything changes, ma'am. That's the nature of things. He walked to the counter and set his gloved hands flat on the wood. This property sits at the crossroads. 2 roads. All the cattle traffic between here and the railhead passes your door. I'm building a supply depot. I need this lot. You need a lot. You don't need this one. I want this one. His voice was soft, which was when Hale Pruitt was most dangerous. $300. That's more than this building is worth. "The building isn't for sale, Mr. Pruitt. The flowers are. Would you like some?" His jaw tightened. She watched it tighten the way she watched a storm build over the ridge, with respect, but without fear. Fear, she had learned, was another creature that fed on regular meals. She had stopped feeding it the year Thomas died. "You're a stubborn woman, Cora." He said her first name like he owned it. Stubborn women in small towns tend to find out how small those towns can get. The bell rang. The cowboy walked in. Hale Pruitt turned. The cowboy stood in the doorway, hat in his hand, his eyes moving from Pruitt to Cora and back with the unhurried attention of a man reading a situation the way Cora read flowers, by instinct, by habit, by something trained into the bones. "Afternoon," the cowboy said. His voice was low and unhurried, the way creek water sounds when it's deep enough to be slow. Pruitt measured him. "We're having a private conversation. Looks like it's over." The cowboy was already at the flower stand, selecting the columbine, the lupin, his fingers moving with that same careful attention. He set 3 dimes on the counter. Cora wrapped the flowers. Her hands were steady. She was aware of Pruitt watching, aware of the cowboy not watching, aware that something had shifted in the room, a redistribution of weight, a change in the air, the way a barometric drop announces itself before the rain arrives. Pruitt left without another word. But at the door he paused and looked back at Cora, and the look he gave her was not anger. It was calculation. The cowboy picked up his flowers. "He bothers you again, you let me know. You don't even know my name." "No, ma'am. I don't." He left. The bell rang. Cora stood behind the counter with Pruitt's calculation and the cowboy's quiet offer sitting in the air like 2 weather fronts about to collide. She did what she always did. She worked. She trimmed stems. She closed the shop at dusk and walked upstairs to the small rooms above it, where the silence was so complete it had its own texture, its own weight, its own particular shade of blue. The next morning, she found firewood on her doorstep. Cut clean, split fine, stacked neat. No note. The road was empty except for a yellow dog sleeping in the dust outside the general store. She brought the wood inside. She made coffee. She sat at her table and held the cup with both hands and let the warmth press into her palms and thought about a man who cradled flower stems like sleeping children and split firewood without a note and said, "You let me know," like it was a vow. Over the following days, she learned things. Not from him. He still came only on Thursdays, but from the town, which talked in fragments and whispers. Mrs. Yarrow, who knew everything and said little, mentioned that the cowboy had hired on at the Double M ranch south of town. "Quiet man," she said, licking her thumb before counting stamps, which she did whether she had stamps to count or not. "Good with horses. The owner's girl has a half-wild Mustang nobody can touch. He had it eating from her hand inside a week. A man who was good with frightened things." Cora filed this alongside everything else she knew, which was almost nothing. She was closing the shop on a Saturday when she saw Deputy Pell crossing the street toward her, and she knew before he opened his mouth that Pruitt had made his next move. Pell had a way of adjusting his hat brim when he was uncomfortable, pulling it down, pushing it up, pulling it down again, and he was doing it now, twice in the span of 10 steps. "Ms. Whitfield," he cleared his throat, "I've been asked to inform you that Mr. Pruitt has filed a complaint with the county about your shop. Says the structure is unsafe. The structure is stone and timber, Deputy. My husband built it. It withstood the hard winter. I'm just the messenger, ma'am." He adjusted his hat again. "County inspector's coming next week. Mr. Pruitt requested it special." She understood what was happening. Pruitt could not buy her, so he would bury her. The inspector would be Pruitt's man. The findings would be predetermined. The shop would be condemned. She would be given a choice: sell or lose everything. She could sell. $300 was more money than she had seen in 2 years. She could take it, move to Denver, start again. No one would blame her. Or she could stay and fight a man who owned the water, the sheriff, the bank, and the county, with a flower shop and 3 silver dimes a week and a cowboy whose name she did not know. She thought about Thomas. He would have stayed. Thomas would have stood in that doorway and told Hale Pruitt to go to hell with the same calm he used to bring Columbine in from the meadow. He would have stayed because he understood that some things are not for sale, and the ground you built your life on is one of them. What would you have done in her place? Sold the shop, taken the money, started over somewhere safe? Or stayed and fought a man who owned everything, including the law? And would you have trusted a stranger who fixed your door and asked nothing in return? The county inspector arrived on a Tuesday. He was a thin man with a thin mustache and a thin way of speaking that made Cora think of a blade wrapped in cloth. He walked through her shop with Pruitt standing in the doorway, arms folded, smiling the way a man smiles when he has already won. The inspector found 7 violations. The foundation was compromised. The roof timbers were rotting. The chimney was a fire hazard. Each finding was read aloud as though for an audience, and the audience was Cora, and the purpose was not safety. The purpose was surrender. You have 30 days to correct the violations or vacate the property, the inspector said. He did not meet her eyes. Cora took the paper. She read it. She folded it. She put it in her apron pocket. I'll see you in 30 days, she said. Pruitt laughed. It was a short, clean sound, like a gate closing. 30 days, Miss Whitfield. Be sensible. That Thursday, the cowboy came for his flowers. The violation paper was sitting on the counter. He picked it up. He read it standing at the counter, his lips barely moving, his eyes going down the list the way a man reads a trail. Who's Hale Pruitt, he asked. Owns the Bar P, largest ranch in the basin. Owns the water rights. Owns the sheriff. Wants this lot. The cowboy set the paper down. He bought his flowers. He left. But that evening, Cora saw him riding south toward the Bar P. She did not know what passed between them until later, until the story came back in pieces from the hands at the Double M, that the cowboy had ridden onto the Bar P and said 3 sentences to Hale Pruitt. The first was, leave the woman alone. The second was, that building is sound. Whoever wrote that report is lying. The third was, I'm asking you civil. I won't ask twice. Pruitt, who had never been asked anything civilly by a man who meant it, had 4 of his hands escort the cowboy off the property. The escort was not gentle. The cowboy came back to town with a split lip and a bruise along his jaw that turned the color of thunderheads. He came to the shop the next morning, not Thursday, but the next morning, and Cora saw his face and said nothing and brought out a cloth and a tin of salve and pressed it against his lip without asking permission. He stood still for it. His eyes, when they met hers, held something she had not seen in another person's eyes in a very long time. Not pity, not curiosity, recognition, as though he were looking at a wound he knew the shape of because he carried one exactly like it. Pruitt won't stop, she said. He'll come back harder. I know. You can't fight him with fists. He has 30 men. Then I won't use fists. He looked at her for a long moment. What I should have done 3 years ago. He did not explain. He took the salve and left, and Cora was left standing in her shop with a sentence hanging in the air she could not make sense of. 3 years ago. What had happened 3 years ago? The answer came 4 days later, in the form of a man she had never seen before, a lean, weathered man with a silver star on his vest that was not the star of Sage Creek Sheriff. He came into the shop on a Monday afternoon and asked for Cora Whitfield by name. Ma'am, my name is James Calloway, Deputy United States Marshal out of the Denver office. He showed her a badge. A man named Silas Rourke filed a complaint with my office. He alleges that Hale Pruitt has committed cattle fraud, falsified water rights documents, and corrupted the county inspection process to force you from your property. I'm here to investigate. Silas Rourke. The cowboy had a name, and the name carried weight. The marshal told her, in the careful, measured way of a man who verifies as he speaks, that Silas Rourke had been a Texas Ranger for 12 years before he left the badge, that he was known in law enforcement circles as a man whose complaints were never filed without evidence, that the evidence he had brought to Denver, sworn statements, land records, water deeds, and a careful accounting of cattle brands that did not match their registration, was substantial enough to warrant a federal investigation. Pruitt found out about the marshal within hours, and that night, Cora heard horses on the street. More than one, more than 3, a heavy drumming that shook the window glass in its frame, and she looked out and saw torches moving toward the Double M Ranch Road. She ran. She had not run anywhere in 3 years. Not since the morning she found Thomas's horse standing riderless at the gate with the saddle empty and the reins trailing in the mud. She ran down the stairs, through the back door, across the yard, and into the dark. The cold air hit her lungs like creek water. She ran south toward the Double M because she knew, with the certainty of a woman who has learned to read the sound of men on horses, that Pruitt's men were going for Silas, and that Silas was alone. She found him at the Double M. He was not dead. That was the first thing, and it was the only thing that mattered for several seconds. She stood in the doorway of the bunkhouse with her chest heaving and her hands shaking, and looked at him upright with a split above his eye and blood on his shirt and his hat still in his hand, and the relief hit her so hard she had to put her hand against the doorframe to stay standing. 3 of Pruitt's men had come. Silas had been waiting for them. He was, despite the quiet voice and the gentle hands and the weekly flowers, a man who had spent 12 years riding through country that wanted him dead. He had put 2 of the 3 on the ground, and the third had run. The ranch owner, a weathered woman named Maddie Crowell who wore her gray hair in a single braid down her back, had come out with a shotgun and made it clear that anyone who returned would be explaining it to her. Maddie gave Cora clean cloths and hot water and a room with a lamp, and then she closed the door and left them alone. Cora sat on a stool beside the bunk where Silas sat with his shirt open, and she pressed the cloth against the wound above his eye, and neither of them spoke for a long time. The lamp hissed softly. The room smelled of pine resin and horse and the faint mineral tang of blood. "Silas," she said. It was the first time she had spoken his name. It felt strange in her mouth, like a word in a language she had once known and forgotten. "Silas Rourke." "Yes, ma'am. You were a Texas Ranger." "I was. You went to Denver. You filed a complaint. You brought evidence against a man who could have killed you, for a woman whose name you didn't know." "I knew your name." She paused. "How?" He did not answer immediately. He looked at the lamp. The flame was steady, a small gold tongue in the still air, and it cast his face in light and shadow, the scarred knuckles, the weathered skin, the bruise along his jaw, and underneath all of it, something raw and open, something a man spends years learning to hide and only shows when the hiding has cost more than he can pay. "I knew Thomas," he said. The cloth stopped moving. The room was still. The lamp hissed. "I met him in the fall of '79, Silas said. "He was running supplies to homesteaders south of here before the hard winter set in. I'd just left the Rangers. My wife, Ruth, she died that spring. Childbirth. The baby too. I was drifting. Thomas found me on the road outside Pueblo, half frozen and not much caring whether I thawed. He brought me to his ranch. He fed me. He let me stay 3 weeks." Silas's voice was steady, but the steadiness was a thing he was holding in place, the way a man holds a cracked beam, with effort, with will, knowing that if he lets go, the whole structure comes down. The morning he rode out to take supplies to the Delgado family, they were sick, the whole lot of them. Up on the ridge, he asked me to ride with him. But there was a mare at the ranch foaling, and she was having trouble, and Thomas said, "Go on, I'll wait," and I stayed. He stopped. Outside, a horse stamped in the corral. He went alone. The storm came in faster than anyone expected. They found him 3 days later in a draw south of the Delgado place. The supplies were with him. He'd gotten them through. He just didn't get himself through. Cora's hand had fallen to her lap. The cloth lay between them, damp and cooling. She could not speak. Her throat had closed around something too large for words. The image of Thomas riding alone into a storm with supplies for 6 strangers. The image of a man she did not know staying behind for a foaling mare. The image of all the small, ordinary decisions that chain together until they become a catastrophe. Before he left that morning, Silas said, and now his voice did crack, a clean break like a branch under snow. He said something to me. He said, "If I don't come back, you look after Cora. You make sure she knows she wasn't just a wife to me. She was the whole reason I had a life worth living." The room blurred. Cora felt the tears come, and she did not stop them. She let them fall, because some tears are not grief. Some tears are the sound of something breaking open that needed to break open. A door, a wall, a shell that has kept a person alive, but has also kept them locked inside. "I couldn't come," Silas said. "I was broken. I'd lost Ruth. I'd lost the baby. And I'd let Thomas ride alone. I couldn't face you. I went south. I worked ranches. I drifted. And every year, I told myself, next year I'll go. Next year, I'll keep my word." He looked at her. "It took me 3 years, ma'am. 3 years to find the nerve to walk into a flower shop and buy columbine from a woman I'd promised a dying man I'd look after." And there it was. The question she had carried for months. Who are the flowers for? Answered at last. Not for a wife. Not for a stranger's grave. For Thomas. For her husband. For the man who had pulled a broken stranger out of the cold and fed him and called him friend and ridden into a storm and never come back. The flowers were for Thomas, and the man who bought them had been keeping a promise made before the storm took everything. Who are the flowers for? She asked, though she knew now. She needed the words in the air, in the room, in the space between them, so they could never be unsaid. For your husband, ma'am. For Thomas Whitfield. He asked me to look after you the morning he rode out into that storm. His voice was rough, stripped down to the grain. I was too late for him. I've been trying not to be too late for you ever since. She pressed the cloth back against his wound. Her hands were gentle. Her eyes were wet. And she said, quietly, the way a person speaks when the words are not for an audience, but for the truth itself. You're not too late, Silas. You're exactly on time. If this story is moving you, you are exactly who we wrote it for. A like and a subscribe tells us to keep going. Tells us there are still people who believe in the kind of love that walks 3 years to find you. The federal marshal's investigation took 2 weeks. 2 weeks during which Hale Pruitt discovered, for the first time in his life, what it felt like to be the one looking up instead of looking down. Silas had not gone to Denver with complaints alone. He had gone with evidence, and the evidence was Cora's, though she had not known it. For 3 years, she had been watching. Every ranch hand who came through her shop, every dropped comment, every brand she saw on cattle driven past her window. She had been absorbing it all without conscious intent, the way a field absorbs rain. She knew which brands were registered and which were not. She knew that the water rights Pruitt claimed on Sage Creek had been filed in 1878 by a man named Orrin Hale who had died without heirs, and that Pruitt, whose first name was Hale, was not Orrin's heir, but had simply taken the name and the rights and dared anyone to challenge him. She had not known she knew these things. She had thought she was merely listening. But when Silas asked her, carefully, gently, the way he asked everything, the answers were already there, filed in the cabinet of her memory, waiting for someone to open the right drawer. The marshal interviewed Mrs. Yarrow, who produced postal records showing Pruitt's men had been intercepting mail from ranchers who tried to file complaints. He interviewed Mattie Crowell, who testified that Pruitt had threatened to cut her water access. He interviewed Deputy Pell, who, under the weight of a federal badge, adjusted his hat one final time and told the truth about every inspection Pruitt had ordered, every complaint buried, every rancher forced out. Judge Holloway arrived on a Thursday. He was a tall man with a gray beard and the unhurried manner of someone who had seen enough injustice to recognize it without surprise. Cora sat in the front row with her hands folded in her lap and watched Hale Pruitt answer for 3 years of theft, fraud, intimidation, and corruption. Pruitt's lawyer argued. Pruitt blustered. His men, loyal as long as the money flowed, discovered that federal marshals carry a different kind of authority than county sheriffs, the kind that does not bend, does not negotiate, and does not accept a cut of the profits. Judge Holloway ruled from the bench. Hale Pruitt was found guilty of cattle fraud, falsification of water rights documents, corruption of public officials, and coercion. His assets were seized. The Barpee was put under federal receivership. The water rights he had stolen were returned to their rightful owners. The sheriff was removed and charged. Deputy Pell, who had testified, was given clemency and appointed interim sheriff by Judge Holloway, who told him, "You told the truth when it cost you something. That's the only qualification a lawman really needs." Pruitt was taken from the courthouse in chains. As he passed Cora on the steps, he stopped. "You did this," he said. "A flower woman." Cora looked at him. She did not smile. She held his gaze with the same calm she had held it every time he stood in her shop and tried to take what was not his. "Yes, Mr. Pruitt, a flower woman, and the ground I stand on is not for sale." He was taken to the territorial prison in Cannon City, and Sage Creek exhaled, a collective breath the town had been holding for years. The violations against Cora's shop were dismissed. The shop stood. The columbine grew. The aspens turned gold, and then bare, and then green again, and Cora Whitfield kept her door open and her flowers fresh, and the world that had tried to break her failed completely. On the first Sunday after the trial, Silas came to the shop, not for flowers. He came to the door at morning light, and Cora opened it, and he stood on her step with his hat in his hands, and he said, "I kept my word, Cora, as close as I could. The rest is up to you." "The rest," she said, "is going to take some time." "I have time," he said. "I've been saving it." She laughed. It was a sound that surprised her, It had been so long since laughter had come out of her mouth that it felt like a bird returning to a nest it had abandoned. She laughed, and Silas smiled, and it was a small, crooked, genuine thing, the first real smile she had seen on his face, and it changed his whole face the way sunrise changes a wall. "Come in," she said. "I'll make coffee." He came in. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. They were the slow, ordinary, extraordinary weeks of two people learning to be in the same room, without the armor they had both worn for years. Silas fixed the greenhouse glass that had been cracked since the previous winter. Cora taught him the names of the flowers, not the common names, but the old names, the language of flowers that her mother had taught her. Columbine for the resolve to endure. Lupin for the steadfast heart. He listened. He remembered. The next Thursday, he came to the shop and bought Columbine and Lupin, the same as always, but this time he stayed. He sat on the stool by the counter while she worked, and neither spoke, and the silence between them was not the silence of loneliness, but the silence of two people who had discovered that being quiet together was its own kind of conversation. Mrs. Yarrow reported to anyone within earshot that the cowboy and the flower woman had been seen walking to the cemetery together on a Sunday, and that they had both stood at Thomas Whitfield's grave for a long time, and that the cowboy had set down his flowers and the woman had set down hers, and that they had stood there side by side, two people honoring the dead who had brought them together. Winter came. The shop glowed warm in the early dark, and the bell above the door rang for customers and for Silas, who came every Thursday and most other days besides, and who one evening in December, while Cora was sweeping the floor and he was turning a piece of pine in his hands with a small knife, carving something she could not see, said, without looking up, "I think Thomas would have liked that I'm here." Cora stopped sweeping. "I think he would have liked it too. I think he would have said something about the Columbine needing more water." She laughed. The sound of it filled the small, warm room and pressed against the cold windows and went out into the night. And somewhere, in whatever place the dead go to watch over the living, a man who had ridden into a storm with supplies for strangers and a promise for his friend smiled. The following spring, Cora Whitfield married Silas Rourke on the porch of the flower shop, with the whole town watching and the aspens just beginning to bud and the creek running high with snowmelt. Mattie Crowell stood as witness. Mrs. Yarrow cried into her handkerchief and then told everyone she hadn't. Deputy Pell, now the elected sheriff, stood at the back with his hat in his hands and did not adjust it once. After the ceremony, Silas gave Cora a small piece of carved pine, a columbine flower, so precise that the spurs of each petal were distinct. He had been carving it all winter. She held it in her palm and ran her thumb over the grain and thought about how love does not always arrive the way you expect it. Sometimes it arrives wearing dusty boots and carrying flowers for a dead man, walking 3 years on a road made of guilt because a promise is the heaviest thing a good man can carry, and the only way to set it down is to keep it. Every Thursday after that, there were 2 bouquets on the counter, Columbine and Lupin, white and blue, wrapped in brown twine, one for the grave on the hill and one for the woman behind the counter. And the man who brought them set 3 dimes on the wood and left, and came back, because that is what love looks like when it has survived the long dark. Not a single grand gesture. 1,000 small ones, repeated until the road runs out. The columbine bloomed again that June in the greenhouse, white as bone, steady as a promise kept. Next, we'll tell the story of a woman who inherited a failing cattle ranch in the Montana Territory, only to discover that her husband's death hadn't been an accident at all, and that the man who caused it was the one person in town everyone trusted. Good night, and thank you for being here.